Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Music Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Lillie Holmes. Today, we're going to talk about topics that all have the reoccurring theme of movie soundtracks. We're going to start out with 50 Shades of Grey and the soundtracks to those movies. Then we're going to move on to see if the remake of Footloose, the soundtrack to that movie, lived up to the potential from the original soundtrack. Then we're going to get into my favorite movie of all time to ever exist, Dirty Dancing, and how that soundtrack did exceptionally well, even though it was expected to flop. And I know you guys will stick around to hear about the age-old debate if a sequel can possibly be better than the original. We're going to talk about if the Grease 2 soundtrack beat out the original of the soundtrack from Grease 1. The first 50 Shades of Grey movie out of the trilogy of movies came out in 2015, and I remember sitting in the theater with my friends, and they were all really excited to see the movie. I'm not sure why, and I was like, yeah, sure, I'll come. I can take or leave movies. I do enjoy them, but it's not something I usually choose to do in my free time alone, unless I find myself really enjoying the soundtracks to movies. And that is something I really enjoyed with this movie. I remember sitting there in the theater. I could kind of take or leave the plot. It was okay. It was a very stereotypical movie plot that I've seen hundreds of times in my life. But I remember watching the movie, and I really enjoyed almost every single song I heard on it. The movie had a very continuous flow of scene and dialogue to song, scene and dialogue to song, scene and dialogue to song. And I was looking forward to hearing the next song more than I was hearing what's going to happen in the movie more. And when the movie finally ended, I walked out of the theater and I went and I looked up the soundtrack to the movie on Spotify. And I was looking at the soundtrack and, the artists and stuff, because I couldn't identify every single artist in the song while watching the movie. But I liked almost every single song, and I was a little taken back by that, because I think sometimes movie soundtracks, they try a little too hard to relate the songs to the movie. I think it works better when songs aren't specifically made for like a show or a movie or anything like that, and songs maybe just pulled from, because maybe producers or writers think the song will fit well with whatever the plot is. But I think that's a good reason why I like, the soundtrack so much, is because, the song Earned It by The Weeknd and Love Me Like You Do by Ellie Goulding were released as promotional singles a little before the actual movie came out. So I got to hear them just as songs and didn't exactly associate them fully with the plot of the movie while I watched it. So I already kind of had a sense of them. So I think that helped a little bit. Again, I don't know. I just feel weird when I'm watching movies and songs were made specifically for it. If it's a musical or something, that makes total sense. But, just with a normal movie like 50 Shades of Grey that has music for whatever reason, I think it works better if you just pull popular songs from, kind of the time period the movie is made in that just help emphasize the plot or the scenes and the dialogue that are going on it for, dramatic effect, because, all movies have a lot of dramatic effect. Not only did the soundtrack do well, in my opinion, it did as well on the Billboard 200 charts, ranking at number 2. It also had the hit singles that were, again, released as promotional singles before the movie came out, like I mentioned earlier, Earned It by The Weeknd and Love Me Like You Do by Ellie Goulding. Both reached number 3 on Billboard's top 10 of the Hot 100 charts. This soundtrack had a lot of popular artists on it, such as The Weeknd, Sia, Ellie Goulding, Frank Sinatra, Beyonce, The Rolling Stones, and many, many more people with some hit songs that I wasn't expecting to hear that were just good classics in my opinion. Like I stated before, I really enjoy most of the songs off the soundtrack, but I would have to say my number one favorite is Love Me Like You Do by Ellie Goulding. That song, I have a certain picture in my head, thankful to the movie, is, the scene where the song starts playing when they're in the helicopter and they're flying around on their first date and he's trying to impress her and all that fancy stuff. But I think this one of the reasons I like the song so much is it's long. I've mentioned before, I like longer songs. I believe it's just a little over 4 minutes. Correct me if I am wrong. So that's one reason I really like the song. And the other one is, I don't know, it's just very freeing, I guess you could say, when you listen to it. And it's just really nice to hear. Another one of my favorite songs off the soundtrack that I don't think I have ever heard in not a Halloween-esque movie or setting would be I Put a Spell on You by Annie Lennox. Again, I don't think I've ever heard that in this kind of a movie. This is a love story type movie, and I heard the song in it, and I was really surprised because, again, I think I've only seen it in like scary, witchy Halloween movies. So I was really surprised. And I also think it's a great choice that they went with some old school music compared to just using, newer artists like The Weeknd or Ellie Goulding. None other than the Queen Bee Beyonce is also on the soundtrack. We have her song Crazy in Love on there. That is just a classic. I say classic like it's old. It's not old, but it's just a classic as in everyone likes it. It's always a good choice. Beyonce usually never strikes out, in my opinion. So that was just a great choice to have her on the album and just kind of keep up with current pop times, you could say. And again, we have Earned It by The Weeknd that I've mentioned already before that did well, earning a spot at number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 charts in the top 10. I really like that song. At this point, it is a little played out over the past few years because it did so well as a promotional single and it did so well in the movie and just did so well everywhere else. I've heard it so many times at this point. I know it by heart, and again, I still like it, but if it has definitely ran its course in my life. But still, I think was a great song, and it really fit the ambiance of the movie. If you've seen the movies and you've heard the song, you know what I mean by that. I think having songs like I Put a Spell on You by Annie Lennox, and then having artists such as Frank Sinatra and the Rolling Stones on the soundtrack was a very smart move. I always think that mixing popular music with older music is a good way to go. I think that a lot of older people think that people, millennials and Generation Z and stuff don't know older music, but that is not entirely true. I know, for example, myself, I appreciate a lot of older songs and artists like Alan Parsons, who's from the 70s and 80s and stuff like that. So I think mixing in older music is a good way to just kind of keep the artist diverse on a soundtrack and keep just a diverse amount of music with different sounds on the soundtrack as well. Moving on to the second movie of the much anticipated trilogy, 50 Shades Darker, that came out in February of 2017. Now, just like the first movie, I really enjoyed the soundtrack to this one as well, and I was very surprised. Something I think is kind of interesting about the second movie soundtrack is, in my opinion, it almost mimicked the soundtrack from the first movie in a few ways. And what I mean by that is the top 2 songs, I believe, from that movie is Not Afraid Anymore by Halsey and then I Don't Want to Live Forever by Zayn Malik and Taylor Swift. And I think both of those songs are very similar to the top 2 songs from the first movie, Earned It by The Weeknd and Love Me Like You Do by Ellie Goulding. Don't get me wrong. If it's not broke, don't fix it. But the second soundtrack did not have as much diversity as the first one, as much as artists and even sound, in my opinion. Even though the soundtrack to the 50 Shades Darker album was not as diverse as the first one, in my opinion, it actually did better than the first soundtrack, ranking at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 charts. I personally think that this is because it had a lot more pop sounds to it than the first one. The 50 Shades Darker soundtrack had Zayn Malik, Taylor Swift, Halsey, Tuvlo, John Legend, Nicki Minaj, Nick Jonas, along with other few artists that are very popular in the pop music world. I would have to say my favorite song off the soundtrack 50 Shades Darker is Not Afraid Anymore by Halsey. I think this song, again, is kind of like Earned It by The Weeknd. It fits the ambiance of the movie very well, and also I just think it's a really good song. I really like Halsey and most of her lyrics and beats and tempos to everything she sings. After Not Afraid Anymore, I really like I Don't Want to Live Forever by Zayn Malik and Taylor Swift. Again, I think that song is very similar to Love Me Like You Do by Ellie Goulding, in just kind of reference to the purpose it plays in the movie. And the song just did extraordinary well outside of the movie, just like Love Me Like You Do did outside of the first part of the trilogy. And then I'd say my third favorite off the song is Helium by Sia. The song isn't talked about as much when referencing songs from the soundtrack, but I really like this one. I think it's because I think Sia has a really, really good voice, and she sings about stuff that is not as sappy and love song cheesiness, kind of like the first 2 songs I named her. Don't get me wrong, I've said it before, I really love sappy love songs and all the cheesiness that comes along with it. But, I also like different stuff sometimes, like Helium by Sia. It's not as, kind of expected. Let's get into the final movie out of the trilogy of movies, 50 Shades Freed, which came out in 2018. The soundtrack for this album did not do nearly as well as the soundtracks for the previous 2 movies. 50 Shades Freed soundtrack peaked at position 5 on the Billboard Hot 200 chart. Now, don't get me wrong, 5 is a phenomenal position to be at for any artist. Just to make it on the chart in general, in my opinion, is a great thing and says a lot about the song and the artist and everyone involved. But it only got to position number 5 compared to positions 1 and 2 for the previous 2 albums. I think this album may not have done as well for a, few reasons. I don't think it just connected to the movie as well, if that makes sense. I think for 50 Shades of Grey and then 50 Shades Darker, I think the album and the plot coincided very well. I don't think that is the same for 50 Shades Freed and the soundtrack that goes along with that. And also, there was not as much, again, diversity on 50 Shades Freed. They had some great artists on there, such as Liam Payne, who was a former One Direction member, then Haley Steinfeld, who is a singer along with an actress and a dancer, I believe, as well. And then Rita Ora was on there. She is a phenomenal singer with a lot of experience. But it just didn't do well, and it just, again, I just don't think it connected with people in the way that the other movies did. And I almost feel like the movies and the soundtracks ran its course by the time that 50 Shades Freed came out. I mean, it was 3 years after the original, the first movie of the trilogy came out. So I think it was, people were almost done with it. They weren't listening to the movie. They weren't watching the movies as much. They didn't care about the story that much. And they also just didn't care about the soundtracks as much as well. If I had to put a list of my favorite soundtracks from the trilogy in order, it would go in order of the trilogy. 50 Shades of Grey soundtrack would be first, then 50 Shades Darker, then 50 Shades Freed. Again, 50 Shades of Grey is my number 1 soundtrack out of all 3 of them. It just has really great songs. Love Me Like You Do by Ellie Goulding will forever be one of my favorite songs to this day. And then also I Put a Spell on You by Annie Lennox. I really enjoy that song, and I really enjoy how it was incorporated to the movie. and also Earned It by The Weeknd is a great song, along with a few other songs on the album. Now, if you asked me to compile a list of my favorite songs from all three of the soundtracks, Love Me Like You Do by Ellie Goulding would still be at the top of that list. Then Not Afraid Anymore by Halsey, I Don't Want to Live Forever by Zayn Malik and Taylor Swift, and also Capital Letters by Haley Steinfeld off the soundtrack 50 Shades Freed. I really enjoyed that song as well. All the soundtracks have great songs to them. I'm a sucker for you could say originality. And, of course I saw 50 Shades of Grey first, so not that that's the original movie, it's just the first one I ever saw, and it's the first one of the trilogy, so that's probably part of the reason I like that one the best. I tend to not like change that much, so that's kind of just that soundtrack is what I associated in my brain with the movie, so that's forever just kind of be almost, you could say, my home base out of the music for all the movies for it. I'd recommend go ahead and listening to any of the soundtracks or any of the songs from the soundtracks. They're all great songs, and maybe you might find a song you've never heard before and you really enjoy. After the break, when we come back, we're going to talk about Footloose and the remake of the movie. Did the soundtrack do as well, and how did it change? And don't forget to stick around later on. We're going to talk about Grease 1 and 2 and the soundtracks and how well they did and how they compare and contrast to each other. We'll be right back after the break, everybody.
Always on the go, but the day just won't be one without your Hollywood fix. Let Golden State Media Concepts Entertainment Podcast take care of that. An all-inclusive look of pop culture.
Welcome back, everybody. We just got done talking about the trilogy 50 Shades of Grey. Now we are going to switch gears abruptly into Footloose. And don't forget, later on, we are going to be getting into Grease Lightning. We're going to talk about Grease 1 and Grease 2 and their soundtracks. The original movie Footloose came out in 1984, and then the remake came out in 2011. Today we are going to be discussing the remake that came out in 2011 along with the soundtrack. The soundtrack for the movies was made to really reflect the small town of Beaumont. Both the movies take place in a small town called Beaumont in the South, where after a horrific accident of some young teenagers losing their lives, dancing and listening to loud music was made illegal. I know that sounds absolutely ridiculous, and watching the movie for the first time, I was really confused. And when I found out that this was based off of a true story where dancing and music was made illegal in a smaller town in the South for over 100 years, I was completely shocked. I never in my right mind thought that was something that would be true in real life, but life is full of surprises now, isn't it? From what I've heard, people didn't have much of an issue with the remake regarding the plot of the movie. People thought the plot of the remake played very true to the original. What people did have an issue with is the soundtrack. The soundtrack of the original movie that came out in 1984 was more of a pop rock and had rebellious tones to it. The remake soundtrack was more country than anything else. There was actually a big to-do if they were even going to use any of the original songs from the original soundtrack. What kind of was the final nail in the coffin that they had to use at least a few original songs was the Footloose musical that came out in 1998. That, obviously used a bunch of original songs from the version of 1984. The remake has 8 new songs on the soundtrack and has 4 original songs, one of those clearly being Footloose, that was originally done by Kenny Loggins, and in the remake is covered by Blake Shelton. The other 3 songs are Almost Paradise, Let's Hear It for the Boys, and Holding Out for a Hero. I personally like the country remake soundtrack better than the original soundtrack, which is kind of odd because if you had to make me choose between like pop or rock and country, I usually would choose more rock. In my opinion, I almost think it's kind of the opposite of what you would be expecting when you first watch the remake of the movie, even if you haven't seen the original. Because, if any of you haven't seen it, the boy, Ren McCormick, comes from up north Massachusetts, where stuff is completely different, as you know, than in Beaumont in the South. So when he comes, you would think he would be bringing in more rock music, and that is what stirs everything up in the town. But no, he comes and he adapts to the country music in the town. Again, I thought it would be more he brings the rock music, and that's what upsets everyone. So I think it's really interesting. They kept the plot but changed the music. Although, again, I really enjoy the music. The soundtrack from the remake of Footloose is probably one of my favorite soundtracks of all movies I've ever seen. So with that being said, this is definitely the first more country music and country themed movie, you could say, that I've really enjoyed, especially again with the soundtracks. I'm not a huge country fan. I do have a few country songs that I love, but again, it's not usually my choice of music when put up against rock or pop or anything like that. Let's backtrack a few steps and get back to what I was saying about people were very skeptical on the album going from pop rock to country. Something that worked in favor of the newer soundtrack on the remake of the movie was the soundtrack was released through Atlantic Records and Warner Music Nashville, which were both big leaders when it came to marketing movie soundtracks. I think that using those two record labels that were very familiar with the process of getting movie soundtracks to have a great deal of popularity compared to being looked over was very, very valuable. For a movie like Footloose, who was, in my opinion, very, very, very reliable on music as well as plot of the story, I think using the bigger record labels was a very, very smart move, again, to make sure it didn't get looked over. Despite all the ridicule and skepticism that the soundtrack for the remake of the movie was not going to do as well, it ended up peaking at number 4 on the Billboard charts and staying there for an astonishingly 78 weeks. That is over a year of continuously being on the charts. I think that is absolutely amazing for a soundtrack that people didn't think was going to do well, one at all, and especially changing the genre from the original soundtrack. Some of my favorite songs on the soundtrack are Fake ID with Big and Rich featuring Gretchen Wilson. I really, 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 really love that song. It's probably one of my favorite country songs that I know. And again, I don't know too many country songs in comparison to maybe, rock and pop and even hip hop. But again, one of my favorites. It has a great beat. And as I've mentioned before, it tells a story. And telling a story, again, as I've gone over many, many times, is so important, in my opinion, when you're listening to a song, especially if you're putting the song into a movie. Now, in this case, with the song in the remake of Footloose, it didn't tell as much of a story in the actual story referring to the plot of the movie, because it was really just a song they were dancing to in a barn. It wasn't a barn, but they were at like a dance place, a ranch or something like that. But still, it's still one of my favorite songs ever. And it's just really upbeat and fun to listen to. I'm also a huge fan of So Sorry Mama by Whitney Duncan off the soundtrack. That is a fun song. Also because I think the song and the lyrics go together very well with the plot of the story when you're talking about the main female character, Ariel, from the remake. I think it just goes along with her character very well because, the song So Sorry Mama is about, this girl, she's so sorry that, she's not doing what her mom said and she's falling for this guy like her mother predicted. And, that that's pretty true to, Ariel in the remake of Footloose, and that's exactly what happens to her. I mean, she's supposed to be this good, preacher's daughter, good girl, and she's acting all rebellious, and at the end of the day, couldn't really care less what her parents think about it. So, the other one I really like is Let's Hear It for the Boys by, what is that? Janet Kramer, who is a huge country singer, and I should say huge. She's a decently large country singer. I know her specifically from her acting on One Tree Hill, but still, she has a wonderful voice, and I really love the song Let's Hear It for the Boys. That, in my opinion, is a really, really country song. Like, when I think of country, I think of that. It's almost the same thing with Footloose. I like Footloose by Blake Shelton a lot more than I like it by Kenny Loggins. I mean, Kenny Loggins was the originator of the song, and Blake Shelton only covered it. And the Blake Shelton version was a lot more upbeat in the remake compared to the Kenny Loggins one in the original, and I think that's why I like it. I said it multiple times. I just really love upbeat music. I don't really care for music as much when it's, really sad and down in the dumps. Once in a while, I do love my sad songs that I can just lay in bed and cry with them. But again, upbeat songs, especially in a movie with Footloose where there's so much dancing, you need the upbeat songs to really get you in the moment, in the mood while watching the movie. Something related to the songs that I found very interesting. The main character, Ariel, God, I can't talk. Ariel, Julian Huff is her real name. She actually didn't sing on any of the songs, despite the fact that she's gone number one on the country charts. I thought that was really interesting, and I wonder if that has to do with she didn't like any of the songs, or if she was mainly more invested with the acting side of this. But I thought that was a really interesting food for thought thing to think about as to why she didn't, choose to sing, when I'm sure she has a wonderful voice. If she wanted to, she could have contributed to it. With all the odds stacked against the remake of this movie, the movie did good, and as well the soundtrack did good, especially because the soundtrack was just so, beaten up before it could even get up. Like, it was just completely beaten to a pulp with the idea of switching genres. And I think it did phenomenal. Now, this is also coming from my generation. When the movie came out, I was 11. I wasn't alive. My parents hadn't even met when the first Footloose in 1984 came out. So I'm not attached to that movie like a lot of that generation of kids is. One day I was sitting out on the patio by the pool, and I was watching Footloose again, because I often rewatch movies that, like I've stated before, that I really like the soundtrack to. So I was sitting on the patio and I was watching it, and my boyfriend's stepdad comes out. He's like, is this the remake of Footloose? And I'm like, yeah. And he was like completely disgusted that I was watching the remake. He's like, why don't you watch the original? This one sucks. I'm like, no, I like this one. That comes a lot from, I like newer stuff. I don't really like watching older movies when the cameras and the stuff just isn't up to date and the quality isn't as well. But again, I saw the remake of Footloose. That was my first version of it. So people who their first version was in 1984, it's going to be hard for them to adapt to the remake version. It's just the kind of way things are. I'm sure, like I've stated before, no one really likes change, especially that's something they grew up in their childhood. Another example is I am very attached to the Disney movies, the High School Musicals. And when I heard that Disney Plus was coming out with a High School Musical, this series, I was like completely disgusted by the idea. I was like, they can't remake High School Musical. It's just not possible. It can't happen. You can't do it. So that is just kind of an example of me not liking change, and a lot of other people not liking change, especially when they've connected the nostalgia to, you could say, better times in their life and stuff like that. But again, I think with all, the odds the soundtrack and the movie had stacked against them, I think it did very well. I mean, peaking at number 4 on the Billboard charts is absolutely phenomenal for anyone, whether it's a remake or an original or anything. Number 4 is a great position, and 78 weeks nonetheless. That is almost like a year and a half straight. That takes a lot of work, and that takes a lot of, like, dedication almost to spending time to create something that many people are going to like and listen to for that long. If you compare the numbers for the two soundtracks, which in this case is very hard to do because they are 27 years apart. This is very hard to do, but so the song Footloose by Kenny Loggins from 1984 hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. It only stayed at number 1 for 1 week, and it was only on the charts for 10 weeks. Now, it did hit number 1, but when you compare that to the remake of Footloose and the entire soundtrack from the movie itself, the whole album peaked at number 4, but stayed on the charts for 78 weeks. Again, this is two very hard things to compare because the time and technology in 1984 was just very different. You couldn't stream and listen to stuff the way you can today. So I'd be very interested to see if they maybe remastered the original Footloose soundtrack album from 1984 to see how it would do nowadays with all the different streaming networks, and it's just a lot easier again to stream stuff because of all the technology we have, or if it would just not do as well because it's almost a thing of the past. But again, it's just such a generational thing. If I would have seen the original Footloose first and then seen the remake, I probably would have said that the remake wasn't as good. But the fact is, we'll never know how I actually feel about that. For me and a lot of people, the first thing you see is just always going to be the better thing, no matter when it came out or whatever the circumstances is. That's just kind of how people's brains operate, I believe. Again, people they do not like change, and they like their version of originality. My advice to you, if you haven't seen either of the movies or heard the bulk of either of the soundtracks, is listen to the remake soundtrack first. Then go and watch the original movie and think about if you think the country genre version of the remake would go better with the original movie. Even though the original movie is supposed to be more pop and rock and more of a rebellious feeling, unlike the remake of the country, which it is still rebellious, but it is more country than, again, pop or rock or anything like that. You might really surprise yourself. Again, I prefer pop and rock over country any day usually, and I really liked the country version more. Again, that has a lot to do with just I saw the remake first, and that's just where those, eggs are going to set. That's just how it's going to be. After the break, nobody puts Baby in the corner, just like nobody puts this soundtrack in the corner. We're going to talk about the one and only Dirty Dancing, the soundtrack, and how the soundtrack did phenomenally well, even though nobody thought it would with a low-budget film. And I know you guys are going to stick around to hear about Grease 1 and Grease 2. We will be right back after the break, guys. Put on your T-Bird jackets and your pink lady jackets.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully, over the break, you might have taken a listen to Footloose's remake of the soundtrack, like I suggested. If not, you are back, and I know you are ready to hear about Dirty Dancing and the soundtrack that has changed my life, not only my favorite movie to ever exist, but my favorite movie soundtrack to ever exist on this planet. If you don't know what Dirty Dancing is, despite the fact that it is the best movie to ever come across the face of this earth, it is a coming-of-age movie, especially for the young girl, starring Jennifer Grey and Patrick Swayze, about a girl who goes on vacation over the summer and falls in love with a bad boy. You've all seen that trope in movies before, but this is the best movie with that trope in particular, so you really should go watch it if you haven't. And if you haven't seen it, I guarantee you have heard the hit song "I've Had the Time of My Life" by Bill Medley. It is played everywhere all the time to this day, even though it came out in 1987. I've said this about multiple movie soundtracks at this point, but I absolutely adore the soundtrack for Dirty Dancing. It is my number one favorite movie and favorite movie soundtrack to ever exist, like I said before. I know every single song. I know every single scene that each song belongs to. It is absolutely incredible. And even though the movie is long before my time, and it came out 12 years before I was even born, my parents hadn't even met yet in 1987, much like with the Footloose movie. It is still something I connect my childhood to for some reason. I guess that's because the first time I ever saw it was when I was a kid. Now, I'm sure you all have heard the hit "I've Had the Time of My Life" by Bill Medley, which I'd say is the most popular song off the album if you were not alive when the movie came out or any of that time. The album went platinum 11 times, and it stayed at the Billboard charts at number one for over 4 months, 18 weeks to be exact. Number one for 18 weeks straight. Something that absolutely breaks my heart when I found out about it is there almost wasn't an album for the movie. Can you believe it? There actually almost was not an album for the movie Dirty Dancing. I mean, I don't even want to live in a world where that exists. I don't want to ever be in that universe, ever. This soundtrack is like half of my personality. I'm not even kidding. Anyone that knows me would agree to it. World and the generation I grew up in, Dirty Dancing was just the hit movie that everybody knew and loved since I've grown up. I mean, I was born in 99 at that point. Dirty Dancing had been out for almost 13 years and was a hugely popular movie, again, that everybody loved. And "I've Had the Time of My Life" was a hit song that just everybody on the earth knew. After doing some research and finding out that Dirty Dancing was actually a very low-budget film, as was the soundtrack, and nobody expected it to do well. I thought that was absolutely mind-blowing to find out. A movie that I hold so close to growing up with, and just I love the song so much. Finding out that it wasn't even expected to do well really is so shocking for me to hear, especially because it did absolutely phenomenal. Again, everybody knows the song "I've Had the Time of My Life." Another piece of heart-wrenching news I discovered while reading an article on the RollingStones.com is Bill Medley originally said no to doing the song "I've Had the Time of My Life." He later changed his mind, obviously, and decided to do it, and later came back and said he couldn't imagine anybody else doing the song. But it's so hard to imagine that someone else almost sang that song, a song that is so deeply ingrained in my life, and I believe in the music industry, period, and the musical industry and theater and things like that. So that is just really, really, really weird to even think about. I always think it's so odd when you find out about the music industry that songs weren't always offered to the person who ends up singing them. Because I'm sure everybody knows that not all artists write 100% of their own songs. There's a lot of writers out there. They'll write a song and they'll envision kind of what artist they want to sing it, and not always the artist they want at the top of their list ends up taking it and doing well with the song. So to think about, a song like "I've Had the Time of My Life," that is one of my favorites, not being sung by the person who sings it is so foreign to even grasp that kind of concept. Doing research on this movie has almost ruined my childhood indefinitely, and all the nostalgia I've awarded to the movie. I found out that the only reason that She's Like the Wind by Patrick Swayze got introduced into the movie and got put on the soundtrack was because they were just lacking as far as music material went. And they were gonna not use it all, but it was really a last resort because they were, again, just lacking as far as songs and all other kinds of creativity. That is something that really threw me through a loop to hear, because She's Like the Wind is one of my favorite songs as well. I like probably the entire soundtrack. Not probably, I do. I love the entire soundtrack to the movie. Every single one of the songs on there. I have a top 5 I'm going to list off to you guys. Number 5 being the one I just stated, She's Like the Wind by Patrick Swayze. Every time I hear the song, 1, I think of Patrick Swayze, and 2, I think of the scene from the movie. I think the scene that the movie goes along with, they coincide together very, very well, as I've mentioned back about other movies and other songs as well. I think it just, you can picture the story and the lyrics, again, just playing together as they should, and nothing is just not making sense when you listen to the lyrics and then you see what's going on in the movie. Number 4 out of my top 5 is Be My Baby by the Ronettes. This song is one of my favorites because it's just a really fun song, in my opinion. It has a lot more chorus and a lot of more vocal backup than songs, I think, nowadays, considering this one is, from 25, 30 years ago. So that's one of the reasons I like it. It goes more old school. And again, I'm not usually too much big when it comes to old school music, but I definitely have my songs that I think are better than some recent pop music when it comes to how the song is made. So again, Be My Baby, I really like the vocal backup when it comes to that. Number 3, we have Overload by Zappa Costa. This song is really, really fun. I'm calling all the songs fun because they're all fun for me, but it's a really fun song for me to listen to. I think it has it goes along with the whole bad boy movie scene that Patrick Swayze has going on in the movie, especially the lyrics and just the whole bad boy theme. It just really fits together really well. Number 2, we have Hungry Eyes by Eric Carmen. This song is a slowed down love song, definitely in the tone of the 80s and 90s, and I believe what that era held as far as music and stuff like that. But I think I really like it, even though it is a slower song, just because I've attached it to the movie. Coming in at number 1, this should be no surprise to anyone, as if you've been listening to any part of this podcast or any part of this segment to begin with. My number 1 is I've Had the Time of My Life by Bill Medley and Jennifer Warnes. This song is not only my number 1 for the soundtrack, but one of my number 1s on my top favorite songs of all time. One of these days, I will give you guys a list of my top favorite songs of all time. We will be here a while because that will take a lot of time and research to put that all together. When I hear this song, I think of the famous scene of Johnny holding up Baby in the Air and the final scene of Dirty Dancing in the movie and all that stuff. In my opinion, this is one of the best songs ever, as far as songs, whether it be just in the music industry or the movie industry. When speaking of soundtracks, it is just one of the best songs of all time. It doesn't need the background behind it from the movie that much, although I think it very much helps. Something that I think is really interesting is the two singers, Bill Medley and Jennifer Warnes, that sing the song are actually supposed to be the older versions of Johnny and Baby from the movie. When they're singing it and when they're performing it in the movie, that's kind of supposed to be, them looking back and really be like, I've had the time of my life and I had all to you. And even though they met at this really unconventional time, then no one thought it would work. Like the soundtrack album itself, this is no surprise to anyone. I've Had the Time of My Life by Bill Medley and Jennifer Warnes hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. Again, no surprise to anyone. Phenomenal song. To this day, I believe it still re-enters the charts every once in a while. According to Stacker.com, the soundtrack for Dirty Dancing is actually ranked at number 11 for top 100 best soundtracks of all time. I would have ranked it at number 1, in my opinion, but 11 out of 100 is still a very good placeholder to have. The last thing I need to do is sit here and defend the soundtrack for Dirty Dancing. The songs, neither nor the movie, needs my defending whatsoever. The movie, and again, the soundtrack has more than proved itself. Again, everybody knows the song I've Had the Time of My Life. And Hungry Eyes, in my opinion, is also a huge song that a lot of people know as well. I remember it was a few weeks ago, I was at the chiropractor, and I was in the back getting muscle stem therapy, and the nurse who was hooking me up to the machines and everything, she had music playing in the background, and she was Hungry Eyes by Eric Carmen. I'm like, oh my God, I love this song. And she looks at me and she's like, you're a little young to know about all this. And I'm like, I get that a lot, but I absolutely adore this movie. And when I think about it, I guess that is kind of true. I remember when me and my boyfriend first started dating, we were in the car and I started playing the song I've Had the Time of My Life. And he's like, oh, this is a really good song. I've never heard it before. I'm like, what are you talking about? You've never heard it before. I was absolutely astonished and almost disgusted with the idea that he's never heard the song before, nor did he clearly, if he's never heard the song, he clearly hasn't seen the movie. And he's like, what? I've never heard it. And I'm like, have you ever seen the movie Dirty Dancing? And he'd never seen it before. And again, never heard the song before. So I guess the idea of everybody knowing the songs and the movie isn't as popular as it is in my mind, but I still think it is very popular. Like, again, they're just very popular songs. My boyfriend just lives under a rock for some reason that he didn't know the song. A really cool part of the soundtrack is Patrick Swayze, who is one of the main actors in the movie, has a song on the soundtrack, which I mentioned before. It's called She's Like the Wind. I've always thought that's really interesting, where movies who have kind of, you could say, dual parts to it, as far as there's a lot of acting and singing or dancing and performing, stuff like that. I think it's cool when actors or actresses, perform their own stunts or, sing their own songs. I've seen a lot of musicals where not all the actors or actresses actually are singing their own song. They're actually lip syncing it, and the soundtrack version, someone else is singing it. So I think it's really cool that, Patrick Swayze did have his own song that he sang, and he is one of the main actors on in the movie. It has been almost 34 years since Dirty Dancing came out, and on the 20-year anniversary, I don't want to call it a remake, but there was some kind of you could call it a spin-off movie type thing called Dirty Dancing. Havana Nights came out. The soundtrack to it is okay. But what I can say is if they ever actually do a whole remake of Dirty Dancing in present day, that soundtrack has got huge shoes to fill. I believe it'll be a lot of the same debate with Footloose, if that they can't not use the original songs from the soundtrack, and what ones they're going to bump out if they don't use all of them. And my guess is they wouldn't use all of them. My guess is if they're remaking it, they are going to want to use more popular songs that are newer, and also write specific songs for the movie if they did remake it. But God, I don't think I would. There's no possible way I would like the remake soundtrack better than the original. It is just absolutely impossible. There, again, no universe where that happens. I hope I have been able to convince you all enough to at least go listen to the Dirty Dancing soundtrack. If not the entire soundtrack, just do me one favor. All you gotta do is listen to I've Had the Time of My Life by Bill Medley and Jennifer Warnes. If you're not going to listen to any of the other songs, that is the only song you would definitely need to know off the album. It is absolutely necessary. This is an SOS. If you haven't heard it, go listen to it right now. After we come back from the break, we're going to finally get into Grease 1 and Grease 2 and those soundtracks. You're going to find out if each soundtrack did as well as the last, and if I liked it as well as the last either. We'll be right back after the break, everybody.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back from the break, everyone. I hope you all had a very nice, relaxing break. Maybe you grabbed a snack, maybe you went to the bathroom, maybe you grabbed a drink, did whatever you had to do in your time of need. We just got done talking about the greatest movie and soundtrack to ever be blessed upon this earth, Dirty Dancing. Again, I recommend you really go check it out if you haven't already. Now we're going to get into the Grease 1 and Grease 2 soundtracks. A lot of people do not think sequels can ever live up to the potential that people bestow upon sequels compared to originals. I admit, being a sequel to anything, especially when it wasn't originally planned, are very, very large shoes to fill. In this case, however, I think that the soundtrack Grease 2, which is the sequel to the movie Grease 1 and the Grease 1 soundtrack, beats out the original by a long shot. I really do. I think it is so much better than the Grease 1 soundtrack, despite the fact that it flopped in all areas. It flopped in means of comparison to Grease 1 and how Grease 1 soundtrack did, how well that soundtrack did, and it also flopped in means of just music in general from all the charts and how underwhelmingly well it did everywhere. I'm sure all of you have heard about the movie Grease at least once. For those of you who don't know, Grease was originally based off a musical that came out in 1971, and then the original movie Grease came out in 1978, starring John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John. Now, the soundtrack to the movie had 24 songs on it, and it sold 38 million copies worldwide. That is in 1978. 38 million copies worldwide in 1978 is an astronomical number, considering people actually had to go to the store to buy things back then. You couldn't stream things, you couldn't purchase anything on iTunes or order it off Amazon or anything like that. You actually had to go to the store and buy it. One, that sounds like a huge burden to me. I hate having, if I have to buy it, if I can't buy it online, it's a usually big deterrent to me that I don't actually need it. If I'm not willing to, go to the store and buy it, then I don't need it. That's kind of my, my way of thinking when it comes to that stuff. But again, 38 million worldwide when people had to go to the store is it's amazing, and it's a huge number. Something that is very, very interesting that similar to what I mentioned before with Dirty Dancing and Patrick Swayze, is John Travolta actually sang almost all of his own parts for the soundtrack. So that's really, really cool. And like I mentioned, I've always thought it's fun that, some actors or actresses will perform their own stunts, or in this case, sing their own songs. So I think that gave the album a lot of originality. And it was also one of John Travolta's, I'd say, most, in my opinion, popular movies around the beginning of his career. It wasn't the beginning, but I'd say it was more the beginning of his career than his career now. Frank Valli's Grease off the album actually reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 along with You're the One That I Want and Hopelessly Devoted to You. Even though the Grease 1 soundtrack is not my favorite out of the 2 soundtracks from Grease 1 and Grease 2, I do have a few favorites off the album. I'm going to give you guys my top 4 off the album because, again, the album is good. It is not my favorite, though. And the songs on here are ones I only have 1 out of these 4 on my playlist. So even though I do like them, I don't like them that much. Number 4, we have We Go Together. I believe it is one of the final songs you see in the movie. It's a good song, and it's really upbeat and has really cool dancing. It's just a little childish to me, and maybe that's why I don't like it. Not that I don't like childish things. I listened to Hannah Montana and High School Musical, you could say religiously, and I'm 21 years old. So it's not that I don't like childish, more immature things, because I most certainly do. It's just, I guess, it's just not my thing, I guess. That's why I don't really like it. At number 3, I have You're the One That I Want. Again, that's one of the songs near the end of the movie. I think that one, I do like it. It's just I think some of the harmonizing in it is what I don't like about it. Hence why I maybe have it at number 3. But I do like it a lot more than out of the other 24 songs on the album because I have it at number 3. Number 2, we have Grease, named after the movie, or the movie named Grease. I think that's a pretty cool song. Again, it's nothing, too awesome or something it's not a song that gets stuck in my head, and I know we can't really control what you get stuck in your head, but I feel like 9 times out of 10 when I do get a song stuck in my head, it's because on some level I do like it, but I just don't want to admit it. And again, I don't think this is the case with this one, considering it's never been stuck in my head. My number 1 favorite song off of the soundtrack is Grease Lightning. I think the song is really, really cool. I truly do like this one. The only issue is I don't personally like John Travolta's voice that well. I do think he has a good one, but I don't know if he's saying he had the best voice for this particular song. I also think the scene for this song from the movie is very cool. That's probably another reason why I really like it. Altogether, I think I would give this soundtrack itself maybe a 7 out of 10. I know some people would be very, very offended by that rating, but again, that's just my personal opinion. The soundtrack and the movie itself did very, very well, and to this day, everyone has heard of the songs, and everyone has at least heard of the movie, and they're very, very popular. And being a greaser is just such a popular theme, and when it comes to costume parties and stuff like that. But the soundtrack itself was not one of my favorites out of all movie soundtracks, and especially, in my opinion, it was not better than the Grease 2 soundtrack. The movie Grease 2 came out in 1982, starring Michelle Pfeiffer and Maxwell Caulfield. Again, this movie, being a sequel, had a lot of shoes to fill. Everyone thought that since Grease 1 and the soundtrack to Grease 1 did so well, that Grease 2 would almost be a shoo-in, considering the budget for not only the movie, but the budget for the soundtrack was almost doubled. And it fell very, very far from any expectations, unfortunately. The album peaked at 71 on the Billboard charts. Now, it is great that they got on the Billboard charts. Don't get me wrong, that is absolutely phenomenal that they made it. If they didn't make it to the chart, that means they would have failed immensely. But at least they did make it. But again, 71 is really pales in comparison to the number ones that 3 songs got from the original soundtrack. I think one of the reasons that the Grease 2 soundtrack may not have done as well as the Grease 1 soundtrack is the fact that it only has 12 songs, which is literally half the amount of songs on the Grease 1 soundtrack. I think, the less songs, the less ability there is for people, not less ability, but the less likely there is going to be songs for people to like. The more songs, the more likely you're going to have people like at least one of the songs, but the less there is, the less likely people's going to like it. Even though there are only 12 songs on the album, I quite thoroughly enjoy about 7 out of the 12 songs that I've added to my playlist because I do really like them. It's not even like I like them just for purpose of watching the movie or if I hear them in public or anything like that. I thoroughly enjoy listening to them. I'm going to give you guys a list of those songs, starting with number 7. Number 7, I have Girl for All Seasons. I think this song I just enjoy listening to it. I think it's really cool, and I also really like when it is sung in the movie, and I like that it tells a story. Again, I've told you I'm a sucker for telling stories and songs. Number 6, I have Do It For Our Country. If you've seen the movie, I think the scene involved in it and the lyrics behind it is just very amusing and fascinating to watch, especially because how different a song like that is compared to the Grease 1 movie, in my opinion. At number 5, we have Reproduction. Again, this one, if you've seen the movie, the scene that comes along with it is very, very amusing and entertaining to watch. And the lyrics are just really, really fun to listen to. Number 4, we have Prowlin'. That is a really, really fun song. I'm calling all these songs fun because they are really fun. But Prowlin', again, is a really, really fun song to listen to. I like that it is more, you could say, Greaser-like when you listen to it because the movie itself is embodying Greasers. The song, I believe, embodies Greasers again. Number 3, we have the song Back to School Again that unfortunately I shouldn't say unfortunately, it got on the Billboard charts, but it only peaked at 71, just like the entire soundtrack itself on the Billboard charts. So at least it got on the charts. But again, I really do enjoy that song. Number 2 is one of my favorite songs ever, I'd say, is Cool Rider. I think that is you could almost say it's a feminist song, and some people have called Grease 2 a feminist movie to begin with, and you could say Cool Rider is part of that movement. It's really cool and fun to listen to. At number 1 off the soundtrack, my favorite song is Who's That Guy? I really like this song because, one, it's long. It's like 4.5 minutes. And it also, if you haven't seen the movie from the song, like the scene that involves the song, I think you would still be able to envision it and picture it perfectly. And it involves almost the entire cast. And it also has that, those parts of the songs where people are almost talking, but they're still singing at the same time. So it's like a conversation that's going back and forth. And it's really, 1, entertaining to listen to, and 2, entertaining to watch and listen to if you're watching the movie. A huge difference between the 2 soundtracks that stick out a lot to me is the soundtrack from Grease 1 really embodies the musical. And, obviously the music is going to embody the musical, but listening to it, I can't picture songs by themselves as much as I can picture them with a musical. And in my opinion, that is, I don't want to say it's a bad thing, but it's not necessarily what I like. When I go see musicals, I think it's really, it's good to be able to go home later, and if you want to listen to that song again, if you decide to add it to your playlist or whatever, that you can listen to it and it doesn't seem so out of place without the context of the rest of the, the musical or the play or the story or whatever. And, that's just kind of a lot of how the songs feel with Grease 1. The songs feel like they don't exactly they can't stand alone by themselves. And that is the key difference with the Grease 2 soundtrack for me. I believe a lot of the songs can stand alone, and when I'm listening to them, when they come on, when I'm riding in the car off my playlist or something, they don't come on and I'm not, almost suffering to listen through them because I don't understand the context behind them, because it doesn't make me feel like I need to understand the story. A lot of the songs just feel like songs, in my opinion, even though some of them are like Reproduction and Do It For Our Country, or songs that are so ingrained with the scene in the movie. When I listen to it, it still doesn't feel like I need to see the scene in the movie to really enjoy the song. And again, that just might be my personal opinion of why I feel like that. It could mean actually nothing, but again, that's something I really think is a huge difference as to why I like the Grease 2 soundtrack better. Grease 1 and Grease 2, their genres are both rock and roll for their soundtracks, but I think the soundtrack for Grease 1, that genre of rock and roll is a little more old school, and I personally would qualify the Grease 2 soundtrack as more of a pop rock and roll than just classic rock and roll, and that's probably why I like it more. I'm more in touch with pop rock and roll than I think classic rock and roll. I shouldn't say in touch, it's just something I'm more used to hearing because of my generation and the music I grew up listening to. So I just usually I usually prefer it better, and that's probably a big reason why I do prefer the Grease 2 soundtrack better. I know I'm not the only one who sometimes wish they could really go inside their brain and could get exact answers on why they prefer something. Because I am really curious as to why I prefer the Grease 2 soundtrack over the Grease 1 soundtrack, considering everybody else thought it was a major failure. And, at the end of the day, people have preferences, and their opinion is their opinion, and we'll never know. But I really wish I could pick my brain apart and find out. Thank you guys so much for listening to the GSMC Music Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask you all to please go ahead and remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us out to let us know all how we're doing, and we can bring you guys the best entertainment possible. Also, if you could please throw us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we would appreciate that so much, very much. Thank you all. Remember to stay healthy, take your vitamins, wash your hands, everything you got to do. You know what it is. Thank you guys. See you again soon.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.